Welcome to Quietly Made. I am so glad you have found your way here tonight. This is a space for the curious and the weary, a place where we explore the vast, invisible infrastructures of our world, while giving your mind the permission it needs to simply rest. Before we begin, I invite you to join our community by subscribing and leaving a comment. I often wonder where these stories find you tonight. If you feel inclined, please leave a comment sharing what part of the world you are in and the hour you are settling into sleep. It is a small way for us to feel the quiet connection of this community, scattered across different time zones, but sharing this same moment of rest. If you fall asleep, that is exactly what should happen. You are safe here. You can always come back tomorrow and pick up exactly where you left off. Adjust your pillow. Take a deep, slow breath in and let it out. Let your mind drift as we begin. Tonight, we turn our attention to the quiet assembly of the internet. Not the headlines or the innovations that captured attention, but rather the patient work of connecting distant places through wire and light. This is the story of how humanity learned to send information across the planet at the speed of electricity, one careful connection at a time. Before there was a network that spanned the world, there was distance. Imagine the vast stretches of ocean between continents, the mountain ranges dividing valleys, the simple space between one building and another. Information moved at the speed of physical transport. A letter carried by ship across the Atlantic might take weeks to arrive. A message sent overland traveled only as fast as a horse could run or a train could move along iron rails. This distance created a kind of isolation. A merchant in one city could not know the prices in another city until days or weeks had passed. A government could not coordinate with its distant territories in real time. Families separated by migration might wait months between communications. The world was large, and that largeness meant delay, uncertainty, disconnection. Human societies had always sought to reduce this distance. Messengers ran between cities carrying news. Signal fires on hilltops conveyed simple messages across valleys. Drums carried information through forests. But these methods were limited by geography, by weather, by the simple fact that they required line of sight or physical presence. Information could not leap across oceans. It could not pass through mountains. It moved slowly, constrained by the physical world. The invention of writing had allowed information to persist across time. Words carved into stone or written on paper could outlive their authors, carrying knowledge forward to future generations. But writing did not solve the problem of distance. A book in one library could not be read in another library unless someone carried it there. Knowledge accumulated in isolated pockets, separated by the vastness of the world. By the time industrial societies began to emerge, this limitation pressed more heavily. Commerce expanded across greater distances. Governments administered larger territories. The need for rapid communication grew urgent. A crisis in one region needed to be known in another region quickly enough for a response to matter. A business opportunity discovered in one market needed to be acted upon before conditions changed. The world was accelerating, but information still moved at the pace of horses and ships. This gap between the speed of events and the speed of communication created a kind of friction, a drag on human coordination. Something needed to change. Some new method of carrying information needed to be discovered, one that could move faster than any physical carrier. The solution would need to transcend the limitations of physical transport entirely. It would need to find a way to send information without sending objects, to convey meaning without moving matter from one place to another. The answer, when it came, would involve harnessing invisible forces that had only recently been understood. The study of electricity had been progressing slowly through the centuries. Natural philosophers had observed electrical phenomena in nature, had conducted experiments with static charges, had begun to understand that electricity could flow through certain materials. By the early industrial age, they had discovered that electrical current could travel through metal wires over considerable distances. They found that this flow could be started and stopped rapidly, controlled with simple switches. They realized that these starts and stops could carry meaning, could encode information. The insight was elegant in its simplicity. If you could agree on a code, if you could establish that certain patterns of electrical pulses meant certain letters or numbers, then you could transmit messages through wire at the speed of electricity itself. Distance would still exist, but the experience of distance would transform. Information would move not at the pace of horses, but at the pace of lightning. The first practical systems used simple on-off signals sent through copper wires strung between locations. An operator at one end would close a circuit, causing a needle to move at the other end. By arranging these movements into patterns, messages could be transmitted. The patterns were arbitrary, agreed upon in advance. A particular sequence of movements might represent a letter or a number. String enough sequences together and words formed. String enough words together and complete thoughts traveled from one place to another at speeds that had been impossible just years before. These early networks were modest in their reach. They connected nearby cities, following roads and railways. The wires hung from wooden poles or ran along the ground. They were fragile, vulnerable to weather and accident. Storms could break the connections. Animals could damage the lines. The systems required constant maintenance, constant repair, but they worked. For the first time in human history, information could move faster than physical transport. A message could travel hundreds of miles in minutes rather than days. The implications were immediate and profound. Governments could coordinate across their territories in ways that had never been possible. Military commanders could receive intelligence and issue orders across vast distances. Businesses could respond to market conditions in distant cities, could coordinate supply chains, could communicate with partners and customers separated by geography. News of events could spread quickly, collapsing the time between occurrence and knowledge. The world began to feel smaller, more connected. Distance had not changed, but the experience of distance had transformed fundamentally. Over the following decades, these networks expanded steadily. More cities were connected. Wires crossed borders. Routes were established, maintained, improved. The technology itself became more reliable as engineers learned from failures, as manufacturing processes improved, as standards emerged for how the systems should be built and operated. Eventually, engineers found ways to lay cables under oceans, connecting continents that had been separated by weeks of sea travel. The work was extraordinarily difficult. Ships carried enormous spools of insulated wire, paying them out onto the sea floor as they crossed from one shore to another. The cables had to withstand water pressure, salt corrosion, the movements of ocean currents. They had to be heavy enough to sink, but not so heavy that they would break under their own weight as they descended. The first attempts failed. Cables broke during laying. Signals weakened over the vast distances. The insulation proved inadequate. Engineers returned to their workshops, refined their designs, tried again. Each failure taught them something about what was required. Each success, even partial success, showed that the goal was achievable. Gradually, persistently, the network grew. By the end of the century, a web of wires encircled much of the industrialized world. Major cities on different continents could exchange messages. The time required for information to cross the planet had collapsed from weeks to hours. This was the first global communications network, a physical infrastructure of metal and insulation that bound distant places into a kind of unity. The networks of that era operated through human intermediaries. An individual wishing to send a message would bring it to an office where a trained operator would encode it into electrical pulses and transmit it. At the receiving end, another operator would decode the pulses and transcribe them back into written language. The recipient would come to collect the message. The process was manual at both ends, requiring skilled labor and physical presence. This system served its purpose for many decades. It enabled coordination across distance. It accelerated commerce and governance. It made the world more manageable, more knowable, more connected. But it had limitations. The networks could carry only simple signals, strings of pulses that operators translated into letters. They could not carry complex information like images or sounds, and they required trained specialists at every node. The network was not yet something that individuals could access directly. It was infrastructure that people used indirectly through professional intermediaries. The next transformation came from a different direction, from efforts to transmit sound rather than coded signals. Researchers discovered that electrical current could be made to vary continuously, following the patterns of sound waves. A device could convert sound into varying electrical current, send that current through a wire, and convert it back into sound at the other end. This allowed voices to travel, not just coded messages. The ability to transmit voice changed what networks could do fundamentally. Instead of encoding messages into patterns of pulses, people could simply speak. The network became more direct, more immediate, more personal. Conversations could happen across distance as if the participants were in the same room, though the quality was imperfect and the process still required manual connection by operators who plugged wires into switchboards. These voice networks grew alongside the older pulse networks. Different technologies, different purposes, but both using the same basic infrastructure of copper wires strung across the landscape. The networks became denser. More connections were made. More nodes were added. The web of communication thickened, particularly in industrialized regions where population density and economic activity justified the investment. During this period, the networks remained fundamentally point-to-point in their operation. When you used the network, you connected to one other location. You spoke to one person. You sent a message to one recipient. The network was a collection of potential paths between endpoints. It routed your signal from one place to another, but it did not create any broader connection beyond that single thread. Each use was isolated, a single strand within the larger web. Meanwhile, in other domains, engineers were working on ways to transmit information without wires at all. They discovered that electromagnetic waves could carry signals through the air, that information could be encoded into these waves and recovered at a distance. This wireless transmission had different characteristics than wire-based transmission. It was less reliable, more prone to interference, limited in range. But it had the advantage of not requiring physical infrastructure between sender and receiver. Ships at sea could communicate with land. Remote locations could be reached without stringing wires across difficult terrain. These wireless systems developed in parallel with wired systems. They served different needs, operated on different principles, used different equipment, but both were networks for moving information across distance. Both were part of the slow accumulation of infrastructure that was making the world more connected, more coordinated, more unified in its ability to share information rapidly. By the middle of the 20th century, the world was crossed by many networks. There were networks for voice transmission, networks for simple data signals, wireless networks for ships and aircraft. Each network had its own protocols, its own standards, its own equipment. They were largely separate, serving different purposes, maintained by different organizations, operating according to different principles. The idea of interconnecting these networks, of creating a network of networks, emerged gradually from several directions at once. Military planners considered how to maintain communications if parts of the infrastructure were damaged or destroyed. Researchers thought about how to share expensive computing equipment across institutions that were geographically separated. Telephone engineers worked on ways to route signals more efficiently through complex topologies where many paths existed between any 2 points. What these different efforts had in common was a shift in thinking about what a network fundamentally was. Instead of seeing the network as a collection of point-to-point connections, they began to see it as a system for moving information between any 2 points through whatever path was available at the moment. The network became more abstract, less tied to specific physical routes. Information would be divided into pieces. Each piece would find its own way through the network, and the pieces would be reassembled at the destination. This approach had several advantages that became clear through experimentation. It made the network more robust because the failure of one path would not prevent information from reaching its destination through other paths. It made the network more efficient because the available capacity could be shared among many users dynamically rather than reserving specific circuits for specific connections. And it made different kinds of networks easier to interconnect because they could use a common method for moving information regardless of their underlying physical technologies. The implementation of these ideas required new protocols, new addressing schemes, new ways of organizing the flow of information. These were worked out gradually through experiments and refinements, through trial and error. Different approaches were tried. Some succeeded, some failed. The process was not planned in detail from the beginning, but evolved through the contributions of many people working on related problems in different contexts. The physical infrastructure that would eventually carry this interconnected network already existed in parts. Telephone companies had laid extensive copper wire networks connecting homes and businesses. These networks were designed for voice, but the same wires could carry digital signals. Long-distance communication systems had laid cables across oceans and continents. Radio transmission systems provided wireless links. What was needed was a layer of equipment and protocols that could use this existing infrastructure in new ways. The equipment took the form of specialized computers that sat at the junctions between different networks. These devices received information from one network, examined addressing information to determine where it needed to go, and forwarded it to the appropriate next network. They made local decisions without needing to know the complete topology of the network. Each device only needed to know its immediate neighbors and have some method for determining which direction would move information closer to its destination. This distributed approach meant that no single point controlled the network. No central authority needed to keep track of every connection. The network could grow organically, with new nodes and connections added wherever they were needed. As long as the new components followed the common protocols for addressing and routing information, they could participate in the network without requiring changes elsewhere. The protocols themselves were carefully designed to be simple and robust. Information would be divided into small packets, each carrying addressing information, indicating its source and destination. Devices in the network would examine these addresses and forward the packets appropriately. If a packet was lost or corrupted, higher-level protocols would detect this and request retransmission. The system built reliability out of unreliable components through redundancy and error checking. These principles were tested in small experimental networks connecting research institutions. The experiments demonstrated that the approach worked. that information could flow reliably through a network where no single path was guaranteed to be available. The networks grew gradually, adding more institutions, more connections, more capacity. They remained primarily tools for researchers and specialists, not yet accessible to the broader population. The work proceeded quietly, without much attention from outside the technical communities involved. During this period, the physical infrastructure continued to evolve in significant ways. Copper wires gave way to fiber optic cables that used pulses of light rather than electrical signals. These optical fibers could carry far more information than copper wires and were less susceptible to interference. The light traveled through thin strands of glass, reflected internally along the length of the fiber, carrying encoded information at speeds approaching the fundamental limit imposed by the nature of light itself. Long-distance connections increasingly used fiber, while local connections often continued to use existing copper infrastructure. The transition to optical fiber happened gradually over decades. Old cables were replaced as they wore out or as demand exceeded their capacity. New connections used fiber from the start. The result was a hybrid infrastructure, some parts optical, some parts copper, some parts wireless, all interconnected through devices that translated between different physical media while maintaining the logical protocols that allowed information to flow. Wireless technologies also advanced during this time. Early wireless systems used radio frequencies that could only carry limited amounts of information. Later systems used higher frequencies that could carry more information, but over shorter distances. The choice of technology depended on the application, on whether coverage or capacity was more important, on the physical environment and available spectrum. The equipment that managed all this became more sophisticated. Early devices were simple, performing basic routing based on fixed tables. Later devices could adapt to changing network conditions, rerouting information around failures or congestion. They could prioritize certain types of traffic. They could enforce policies about what information could flow where. The intelligence of the network moved into these devices scattered throughout the infrastructure, making decisions locally based on global protocols. By the time these technologies had matured, the network had grown large enough that it began to exhibit emergent properties. The behavior of the whole became more than the sum of its parts. Traffic patterns formed and evolved. Bottlenecks appeared and were addressed. The network balanced load across available paths. It adapted to failures. It grew without requiring central planning or coordination. For the network to function as a unified whole, despite being built and maintained by many different organizations using different technologies, standards were essential. These standards specified how information should be formatted, how addresses should be structured, how devices should behave when receiving different types of messages. They created a common language that allowed diverse components to interoperate. The development of these standards involved extensive negotiation and compromise. Different organizations had different priorities different existing investments, different ideas about the best approaches. The standards that emerged were often not the most elegant or efficient possible solutions, but rather the solutions that could gain broad acceptance, that accommodated the constraints and preferences of many stakeholders. Some standards were formal, developed through official processes by recognized standards bodies. Others were informal, emerging from common practice or from widely adopted implementations. The formal standards provided legitimacy and stability. The informal standards provided flexibility and speed of evolution. Both were necessary. The network needed enough consistency to function reliably, but enough flexibility to adapt and improve. One crucial standard defined the addressing system. Every device connected to the network needed a unique address so that information could be routed to it. The addresses needed to be structured in a way that made routing efficient, so that devices did not need to keep track of every address individually. The solution was hierarchical addresses that indicated both the general region and the specific device within that region. This allowed routing decisions to be made based on partial information, examining only the parts of the address necessary at each step. Another crucial standard defined how devices would discover what addresses were reachable through which paths. This routing information needed to be distributed throughout the network so that each device could make informed forwarding decisions. But the information also needed to be kept current as the network topology changed, as new connections were added and old connections failed. The protocols for distributing routing information balanced the need for accuracy against the overhead of constantly updating every device. As the network grew, the standardization efforts expanded to cover more aspects of how information was transmitted and how services were provided. Standards emerged for how to establish reliable connections between distant endpoints, how to encrypt information for privacy, how to name resources in a consistent way, how to translate between different naming schemes. Each standard built on earlier standards, creating layers of protocols that handle different aspects of communication. This layering meant that higher-level services did not need to concern themselves with low-level details. A system for transferring documents between computers did not need to know whether the underlying connection used copper wires or optical fibers or wireless transmission. It only needed to know that the lower layers would reliably deliver information to the specified address. This separation of concerns allowed different parts of the network to evolve independently, with changes at one layer not requiring changes at other layers as long as the interfaces between layers remained consistent. The standards also enabled competition and innovation. Because the interfaces were open and documented, any organization could build equipment or software that participated in the network. They did not need permission from any central authority. They only needed to follow the standards. This openness led to rapid innovation as many different entities experimented with new approaches, new services, new applications. At the same time, the need to maintain compatibility with existing systems constrained how quickly the network could evolve. Changes to fundamental standards required careful planning and gradual deployment, because during the transition period, old and new systems needed to coexist and interoperate. Some legacy standards persisted long after better alternatives were available, simply because the cost of transitioning was too high, or because enough existing systems depended on them. The process of standardization was never complete. As new technologies emerged, as new uses were discovered, as problems with existing standards became apparent, the work of developing and refining standards continued. It was an ongoing negotiation between the desire for stability and the need for improvement. While the physical infrastructure and protocols were being standardized and deployed, the types of information flowing through the network were changing. Early uses were simple in nature. Researchers transferred data between computers. Engineers remotely accessed systems. Specialists exchanged messages. The network was a tool for technical work, not yet something that reached into everyday life for most people. The transformation began when services emerged that made the network accessible to people without technical expertise. Instead of requiring knowledge of protocols and commands, these services provided simple interfaces. You could compose a message in familiar terms. You could search for information without knowing where it was located. You could access resources without understanding the underlying mechanisms that made access possible. These services operated at a layer above the basic network infrastructure. They used the network to move information, but added structure and meaning to that information. They organized knowledge in ways that made it discoverable. They connected people with shared interests. They provided platforms for expression and exchange. The network became not just a means of transmission, but a medium for culture, commerce, and community. The transition from technical infrastructure to everyday medium happened gradually over many years. Early adopters were those who saw potential in the new capabilities. They experimented with different forms of communication, different ways of organizing information, different models for interaction. Some experiments succeeded and grew. Others failed and disappeared. The medium evolved through this process of variation and selection, shaped by what people found useful or engaging. As the services became more sophisticated and the barriers to access decreased, the network reached wider populations. It moved from research institutions to businesses to homes. The infrastructure expanded to meet the demand, with new connections laid, new capacity added, new technologies deployed. The growth was not uniform. Some regions were connected early and densely. Others remained on the periphery, reached later and less completely. The shift from technical tool to everyday medium brought new challenges that had not been anticipated in the original design. The network had been designed for reliability and flexibility, but not specifically for security or privacy. The early protocols assumed a level of trust among participants that was appropriate for small communities of researchers, but not for a global network open to anyone with the technical means to connect. As the network grew and diversified, these assumptions became problematic. Solutions were developed and deployed to address these concerns. Encryption protocols allowed information to be protected as it flowed through the network. Authentication systems verified identities. Access controls limited what different users could do. These security measures were added as layers on top of the existing network, preserving the openness and flexibility that had enabled the network's growth while addressing the risks that came with that openness. The economic model of the network also evolved during this period. Initially, the infrastructure was funded by governments and research institutions as a tool for advancing knowledge and maintaining capabilities. As the network became commercial, businesses invested in infrastructure and services with the expectation of returns. The costs of connectivity were distributed in various ways, sometimes paid by users directly, sometimes subsidized by advertising, sometimes bundled with other services. These economic arrangements shaped how the network developed. Infrastructure was deployed where it could be profitable, which often meant dense deployment in wealthy urban areas and sparse deployment in rural or poor regions. Services were designed to attract and retain users, which influenced what features were prioritized and what behaviors were encouraged. The network's technical architecture remained mostly neutral, but the services and content flowing through it reflected economic incentives. The governance of the network became more complex as it grew. Questions arose about who had authority over different aspects of the network, who could make decisions about standards and policies, how disputes would be resolved. Some aspects were governed by formal institutions. Others were governed by informal norms and practices. The result was a patchwork of governance mechanisms, some hierarchical, some distributed, some based on consensus, some based on market forces. Today, the network exists as a layer of the built environment, mostly invisible, but everywhere present. The physical infrastructure includes cables buried under streets, fibers strung along utility poles, wireless transmitters on towers and rooftops, data centers filled with equipment that processes and stores information. This infrastructure requires constant maintenance and periodic upgrade, but it operates reliably enough that most people never think about it. The information flowing through this infrastructure moves at speeds approaching the physical limits imposed by the properties of light and matter. A query sent from one side of the planet receives a response from the other side in fractions of a second. The distance still exists in physical terms, but it has been compressed to the point where it is barely perceptible in terms of communication. The world has become, in terms of information flow, effectively small. The devices that people use to access the network have become commonplace. They sit on desks, are carried in pockets, are embedded in other objects. They vary in capability and form, but share the fundamental property of being able to send and receive information through the network. These devices are the visible interface to the invisible infrastructure, the points where human activity intersects with the global system of connectivity. The uses of the network have expanded far beyond the original purposes. People use it to communicate with family and colleagues. They use it to access information on virtually any topic. They use it to conduct commerce, to be entertained, to coordinate activities, to monitor systems, to control devices at a distance. Organizations use it to coordinate operations, to process transactions, to store records, to analyze data. The network has become infrastructure in the deepest sense, a foundation upon which other activities depend, so embedded that its presence is assumed rather than noticed. This ubiquity means that disruptions to the network have broad consequences. When connections fail or capacity is exceeded, the effects ripple through many domains. Communication stops. Transactions cannot complete. Services become unavailable. The dependence on the network has grown so deep that alternatives often no longer exist. Many activities now assume connectivity and cannot proceed without it. The network's infrastructure is not uniformly distributed across the world. Some regions have extensive, high-capacity networks with multiple redundant paths. Others have limited or unreliable connectivity, dependent on single connections that are vulnerable to failure. This disparity creates a kind of informational geography where location affects what information and services can be accessed, what opportunities are available, what participation in broader systems is possible. The network has made the world smaller for those connected to it, but it has also created new forms of distance for those not connected or poorly connected. The flow of information through the network is constant and enormous in scale. Every moment, vast quantities of data move between points. Messages are exchanged. Files are transferred. Streams of video and audio flow. Sensor readings are transmitted. Transaction records move between systems. Automated systems communicate with each other. This flow is largely invisible to any individual participant who sees only their own small interaction, unaware of the countless other interactions happening simultaneously. The network routes all this traffic efficiently, finding paths through the infrastructure, balancing load across available connections, handling congestion when demand exceeds capacity, recovering from failures when they occur. The routing happens automatically, based on the protocols and the current state of the network. No human intervention is required for routine operations. The system is self-organizing to a large degree, with each component making local decisions that collectively produce global behavior. This traffic follows patterns that can be observed and analyzed. There are daily rhythms as activity rises and falls with human schedules in different time zones. There are geographic patterns as information tends to flow more densely within regions than between regions, though cross-regional traffic is substantial and growing. There are temporal patterns as certain events generate surges of activity. The network adapts to these patterns, allocating resources where demand is highest, routing around bottlenecks, maintaining service even as conditions change. The information flowing through the network is not all equivalent in nature or purpose. Some is personal communication between individuals. Some is commercial transaction data. Some is entertainment content being streamed to viewers. Some consists of automation and control signals for other systems. The network itself does not distinguish between these types in its basic operation. It moves packets from source to destination regardless of content. But the services and applications built on the network do distinguish, treating different types of information according to their purposes and requirements. The global nature of the network means that information crosses many borders as it travels. A message might be routed through multiple countries on its path, from source to destination. A service might store data in one location while serving users in many other locations. This geographic dispersion creates complexities around jurisdiction, governance, and control. Different regions have different laws and norms, but the network operates as a unified technical system that does not inherently respect political boundaries. The network has enabled certain activities to become genuinely global in scope. Commerce can be conducted between parties on opposite sides of the planet as easily as between neighbors in the same city. Collaboration can happen among people who have never been in the same physical location. Information published in one place becomes accessible everywhere the network reaches. Communities form around shared interests rather than shared geography. This globalization of information flow has effects that are not purely technical in nature. It changes how culture spreads, how ideas circulate, how influence operates. Information that was once localized can now propagate widely and rapidly. Voices that were once isolated can now reach global audiences. The gatekeepers who once controlled the distribution of information have been partially circumvented, though new gatekeepers have emerged in the form of platforms and services that organize and curate the flow of information. The network has also enabled new forms of collective activity that were not possible in earlier eras. Large numbers of people can coordinate without centralized leadership or formal organization. Information can be aggregated from many sources to create resources that no individual could produce alone. Problems can be solved through distributed contribution. The network provides the infrastructure for these forms of coordination, though the social mechanisms that enable effective collaboration are complex and varied, extending beyond the technical capabilities of the network itself. At the same time, the network's global reach means that harmful activities can also operate at global scale. Information that is false or misleading can spread as easily as information that is true. Malicious actors can target systems anywhere the network reaches. The same technologies that enable beneficial coordination also enable harmful coordination. The network itself is neutral in this regard, but its effects depend on how it is used and by whom. The network exists as a kind of utility, similar to water or electricity in some ways. It is infrastructure that enables activity, but does not determine what activity occurs. It provides capacity for moving information, but does not specify what information should move or why. This neutrality is both a strength and a limitation. It allows the network to serve many purposes, to adapt to many uses, to remain flexible and general. But it also means the network cannot ensure that those purposes are beneficial or that those uses are constructive. The creation of this global infrastructure represents a particular kind of achievement in human coordination. It required cooperation across organizations, across nations, across competing interests. It required agreeing on standards while allowing diversity in implementation. It required building systems that could grow without centralized planning. These are not primarily technical achievements, but social and institutional achievements, though they enable technical systems of unprecedented scale and capability. The network has changed the texture of human experience in ways that are subtle but profound. Distance feels different when communication is instantaneous. Knowledge feels different when vast amounts of information are readily accessible. Community feels different when it can form around interest rather than location. Time feels different when events can be known and responded to immediately, regardless of where they occur. These changes are not inherently good or bad. They are simply different, creating new possibilities and new challenges, enabling certain activities while complicating others. There is a kind of quiet wonder in the fact that information can traverse the planet in milliseconds, that the infrastructure enabling this exists and operates reliably, that it emerged through the cumulative efforts of countless individuals over many decades. The network is not natural. It required intention, effort, resources, coordination. But it is now so embedded in daily life that it feels almost inevitable, as if it had always existed or was destined to exist. The network will continue to evolve in ways that we can only partially anticipate. New technologies will increase capacity. New protocols will enable new capabilities. New services will create new uses. But the fundamental nature of the network as infrastructure for moving information will likely persist. The forms may change, but the purpose remains consistent across time. Connecting distant points, enabling exchange, reducing the friction of distance in the realm of information. The trajectory of the network points toward greater capacity, lower latency, broader reach. The physical infrastructure will continue to improve. Fiber optic links will carry more information over longer distances. Wireless technologies will provide higher speeds and more reliable connections. The geographic coverage will expand, reaching regions currently underserved or not served at all. The equipment managing the network will become more sophisticated. Routing will become more adaptive, responding more quickly to changing conditions. Security will become more robust, better protecting against evolving threats. The management and operation of the network will become more automated, with systems monitoring themselves and responding to issues without human intervention in many cases. The devices people use to access the network will become more diverse and more embedded in the environment. Some will remain general purpose, but many will be specialized for particular functions. The line between what is a network device and what is simply an object will continue to blur as connectivity becomes a standard feature rather than a special capability. The network will become more ambient, more present without being noticed, integrated into the fabric of daily life, rather than being a separate domain that one enters and exits. The services and applications built on the network will continue to proliferate and evolve. New forms of communication will emerge. New ways of organizing information will be developed. New applications that we cannot now anticipate will be enabled by capabilities not yet available. The network will remain a platform, a foundation upon which many different structures can be built, rather than a finished product with a fixed set of uses. The challenges associated with the network will also persist and evolve. Questions about access and equity will remain as the network's importance grows. Questions about governance and control will become more complex as the network becomes more central to society. Questions about privacy and security will require ongoing attention as both threats and protections advance. The network is not a problem that will be solved, but a system that will require continuous maintenance and adaptation. There is a possibility that the network will become so integrated into other systems that it ceases to be perceived as a separate thing. Just as electrical infrastructure powers countless devices without being constantly noticed, the network might fade into the background, assumed rather than observed. Connectivity might become as unremarkable as electricity, noticed only when absent. This invisibility would represent a kind of maturity, a completion of the transition from novel technology to essential infrastructure. The information flowing through the network might also change in character over time. As more devices generate and consume information, as more processes are automated, the proportion of traffic that represents human-to-human communication decline relative to machine communication. The network would become not just a medium for human interaction, but a nervous system for technological systems, carrying the signals that coordinate complex distributed operations. These systems might manage resources, optimize processes, monitor conditions, respond to changes. They would operate largely autonomously, with human oversight, but not human direction of every decision. The network would enable this distributed intelligence, providing the communications substrate that allows components to coordinate their behavior without centralized control. The long-term evolution of the network is fundamentally uncertain. Technologies will change in ways we cannot fully predict. Uses will emerge that we cannot anticipate. Challenges will arise that we do not currently foresee. But certain principles seem likely to persist. The value of connecting distant points, the utility of enabling information flow, the power of coordination across distance. These have been consistent throughout the network's history and seem likely to remain relevant into the future. In quiet moments, it is possible to reflect on what has been built over these many decades. A global infrastructure spanning the planet, connecting vast numbers of devices, enabling countless interactions every moment. An infrastructure that emerged gradually through the contributions of many people, through the accumulation of standards and technologies and deployments. An infrastructure that now operates so reliably that we depend upon it without thinking about it. This infrastructure did not arise inevitably. It required choices, investments, cooperation. Different choices would have produced different systems. The network we have reflects the priorities and constraints and possibilities of the era in which it was built. It embodies particular technical approaches, particular economic models, particular assumptions about how communication should work. Yet for all its particularity, the network has achieved a kind of universality. It serves many purposes, enables many activities, connects many people. It has become a common resource, infrastructure that is used but not owned by any single entity. This commons exists through a combination of technical standards, institutional arrangements, and shared norms. It requires maintenance and governance, not just technical operation, but ongoing negotiation about how the network should evolve and who should have access to it. The network has changed how we experience the world, how we relate to distance, how we access information, how we coordinate activity. These changes are now so familiar that it is easy to forget they were not always present. There was a time, not so long ago in historical terms, when the network did not exist, when information moved slowly, when distance meant isolation, when knowledge was localized. The transformation has been rapid by historical standards, compressed into a few decades of intensive development and deployment. Looking forward, the network will continue to be shaped by human choices. Technical possibilities constrain what can be built, but they do not determine what will be built or how it will be used. The future of the network will depend on decisions about investment, about standards, about access, about governance. These decisions will be made through various processes, some centralized, some distributed, some deliberate, some emergent. The network might become more decentralized, with intelligence and control distributed to the edges rather than concentrated in central points. Or it might become more centralized, with a few large entities providing most services and managing most infrastructure. The technical architecture allows for both possibilities. Which emerges will depend on economic and political factors as much as technical ones. The reach of the network might become truly universal, connecting every location and every device. Or it might remain uneven, with persistent gaps and disparities. The costs of deployment and the returns on investment will shape where infrastructure is built. Policy choices about subsidy and regulation will influence access. The network's geography will reflect these forces. The uses of the network will certainly expand and diversify in ways we can only partially imagine. New applications will emerge that we cannot now envision, enabled by capabilities that do not yet exist, or by combinations of existing capabilities in novel configurations. The network will be adapted to purposes its creators did not foresee, as has happened with every general-purpose technology throughout history. It will enable both beneficial and harmful activities, as its neutrality allows it to serve any purpose that can be implemented through the movement of information. The story of the network is not finished. It continues to evolve, to expand, to change. New chapters will be written by the people who build and maintain and use it. The technical systems will advance. The social systems surrounding them will adapt. The relationship between the network and human society will continue to develop in ways that cannot be fully predicted or controlled. But the current chapter has reached a kind of completion. The network exists. It works. It has become infrastructure. The goal of connecting distant points and enabling the flow of information has been achieved at a global scale. What began as experiments in transmitting electrical pulses through wires has become a planetary system of extraordinary complexity and capability. This system operates quietly, mostly invisible to those who use it, enabling the activities of daily life. It requires vast amounts of equipment, enormous quantities of energy, constant maintenance and oversight. But from the perspective of any individual user, it is simple and reliable. You send information. It arrives at its destination. The complexity is hidden, the infrastructure transparent. The network represents a particular form of human achievement, not the work of any individual, but the cumulative result of many contributions over many years. Not planned in detail from the beginning, but evolved through experimentation and refinement. Not perfect or complete, but functional and useful, serving purposes both intended and unexpected. As we leave the history of this system behind, let the weight of its complexity fade, leaving only the steady rhythm of your breath. And so, the narrative of this assembly comes to its quiet conclusion. Whether you are still awake, or whether you have already drifted into a deep and peaceful sleep, know that you are exactly where you need to be. The world is vast, but tonight, its systems are simply the backdrop to your rest. Thank you for joining me here at Quietly Made. Rest now. Join us again tomorrow. Good night.